A trade deficit does not mean that someone is cheating you. A trade deficit of the United States simply means that the United States spends more than it earns. The United States will be the number one loser. This is for sure, because these are policies by the United States, and they are isolating the U.S. economy. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu wants the United States to go to war with Iran, which would be absolutely mindless and destructive. Israel's policy in the Middle East is a disgrace. Israel, in my view, has been committing genocidal crimes in Gaza. The big mistake that Ukraine made was abandoning neutrality and aiming to become part of NATO. The terms that Ukraine could have gotten 3 years ago on April 15th, 2022 in the Istanbul process were better terms than they can get now. The big powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, should take care not to go into conflict with each other.
We are living in strange times. Leaders talk of ending the war in Ukraine, not for the lives lost, but for the minerals buried beneath them. In Gaza, there are children, but no childhood. Arms manufacturers are breaking records as humanitarian aid for the broken societies dries up. Markets are crashing, islands with penguins are being tariffed, and common people don't know where their next meal is coming from. While Arctic glaciers melt, world powers are racing, not for green policies, but for geopolitics. The so-called rules-based order is completely crumbling, or as economist Jeffrey Sachs calls it, the US-based world order. So who better to help us make sense of this moment than Professor Sachs himself? Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you so much for taking out the time and talking to me. And sorry for that ominous start, but these are the times we're living in, isn't it?
Well, great to be with you. Thank you. Yes, these are serious subjects in very disrupted times.
All right, let's start with the man sitting in the White House, sir. What do you make of President Donald Trump's presidency so far?
Well, it's very unstable. We are in one-person rule in the United States. Our government is right now ruled by executive decree. This means that one person calls the shots. We don't have legislation. We don't have Congress. Even when courts make decisions, the White House ignores those court decisions for the moment. So this is a very unusual time for the United States. We have a constitution, and that generally governs how we rule. But President Trump is claiming emergency powers all over the place. It's notable that all those tariffs that were put on, then taken off, then put back on, then postponed, all of that is by decree, not by legislation, not by a vote of Congress. So this is the most particular feature of the current scene, and it's quite unusual, and it means that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty and instability.
Right. Let's start a conversation with tariffs. That's something everyone has been talking about, and I want to talk about the repercussions of it, what it means for the world. But let's start from the American voter. How much merit is in Trump's claim when he says tariffs could replace income tax?
Well, quantitatively, this makes no sense at all. Our budget deficit is around 7% of gross domestic product, and the tariffs maybe could collect 1% of GDP. Quantitatively, this is wrong. And if they did collect 1% of GDP, it would be very disruptive indeed. So I think that the idea of tariffs as being the great revenue source for closing this enormous $2 trillion budget deficit that the United States has is just simply fatuous.
And also how tariffs work. Isn't it true that there's a high chance the American voters themselves will have to face the brunt of it?
Of course, tariffs will disrupt the value chains that produce goods and services that people need and want. And we know that the tariffs that have been imposed would raise substantially consumer costs for many different areas of the economy. And one by one, Trump postponed or eliminated or offset or gave an exemption for those areas that there was backlash. He ended up postponing almost everything in the end. In other words, this is not a policy that's thought out. It's not a policy that has broad support. It's not a policy that's going to raise living standards. So this is why it's also itself so erratic, because it doesn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, you improvise.
Also, something interesting is happening in Chinese social media. I don't know if the Trump administration saw it coming, but after the tariffs it has levied against China, the local manufacturers who have been working closely with some of the big American companies have been going on TikTok and other social media platforms to, in a way, sway the American voters in calling for them to buy goods at a much cheaper rate directly from them. What do you make, how do you make sense of this?
Well, I'm not an expert in Chinese social media, so I don't know what the messages are exactly. But I'd say on the broader point, what Trump has done in a very short period of time is really broken relations between the two leading trade economies, the United States and China. The repercussions of that are extremely serious, mostly for the United States, by the way. The US depends on China in many ways, both for the goods that it buys from China, the supply chains, the rare earth, the minerals that the US and others get from China, and from China's holdings and buying of US Treasury notes, because remember, the United States has to fund a huge deficit day after day, month after month. And we've already seen that the financial markets are deeply dislocated by all of this. In other words, I have yet to see a single positive feature of any of this instability of recent weeks.
Professor Sachs, Trump has been justifying his tariff policy under the pretext that the US's friends as well as foes have been mooching off for decades. Now, as you also correctly pointed out, there are trade deficits. But I'm wondering, isn't this also a system that not only Washington has created over the years, but also benefited from it? So, isn't it hypocritical that the US now wakes up and wants to upend the entire trade system?
I think the most basic point is a very simple one. A trade deficit does not mean that someone is cheating you. A trade deficit of the United States simply means that the United States spends more than it earns. That's all it means. It means that Americans buy a lot. One reason they buy a lot is that the government is our credit card. The government borrows for the country. It borrows heavily, and then it makes transfer payments to businesses and to households of various kinds, and that means income or that means spending, I should say, that is basically spending on the basis of a debt. And so this is all the trade deficits mean. For Trump to say that the U.S. trade deficit is because the US is being cheated is like someone going out and shopping and buying something on a loan and then accusing the shop that sold them that of cheating them. No, this is what it means to borrow from others. And the United States has been borrowing from others for many decades now. The US doesn't like to tax the rich donors that pay for the US Congress want to keep their taxes down, so the government runs a chronic deficit, so the country as a whole spends more than it earns, and we have trade deficits, which Trump then blames on foreigners. So you couldn't make this up. It's so bizarre and absurd, but that's actually what is happening right now. There is no justification whatsoever at all to the claim that because the United States is running a trade deficit, other countries are cheating the United States.
Do you think China is going to be the winner in Trump's trade war?
There really aren't winners in trade wars. Trade is a mutually beneficial activity. That's the whole idea. Maybe this is not something understood in Mr. Trump's mind, that you could have things that benefit both sides, because he thinks in terms of win-lose, who's he going to crush, how's the United States going to come out on top. When you disrupt trade, you have losses all over the place. And Trump's actions have disrupted the world trade system. We don't know yet the consequences, because all of the instability of policy means we have no idea what the policy actually is going to land on. But I wouldn't say that China will win, but I would say that the United States will be the number one loser. This is for sure, because these are policies by the United States, and they are isolating the U.S. economy. They're raising the prices of U.S. goods. They're making U.S. manufacturing less efficient, because if you don't buy inputs from abroad at the lowest cost, how can those companies be competitive exporters in world markets? The answer is they can't. So the big loser definitely is the United States, but I'd say everyone else loses something in this as well by all of this disruption.
Let me reframe then. What I was trying to say is that aren't the other countries now looking at the other giant like China and Russia for fending off from what they are seeing in a sort of mistrust when it comes to the relationships with the US? Are they looking away now?
What Trump is trying to do is to say, you make a deal with us and you cut out China. If countries fall into that trap, I think there will be increasing danger for the entire world, because we will enter a downward spiral of the trading system itself. If instead countries, governments say, look, the United States is making a mistake, it's isolating itself, but we continue the open trading system with each other, with the rest of the world, this would be the thing that spares the rest of the world a disaster. So the question now is, first, will Trump maintain these tariffs? Will the US courts declare them illegal? Because in my view, they are illegal. They're based on a phony declaration of emergency. But if they do stick, will other countries retaliate against each other? Will they introduce new trade barriers against each other at the behest of the United States? Trump is actually asking India or Europe or others, oh, you should punish China. If we go down that road at the behest of this absolutely damaging U.S. policy, well, then the U.S. will succeed, in quotation marks, in wrecking the whole world. If the rest of the world takes a deep breath and says, we don't want to go there, we know that the open trading system is mutually beneficial, then it will be the U.S. that bears the brunt of the costs, and the rest of the world will be spared the brunt of the costs.
All right, sir, let's shift focus now. You have been a student as well as a professor at Harvard University. What do you make of the university's standoff with the government right now?
The United States is, again, the Trump administration is attacking the universities. Partly it's a kind of cultural revolution that bringing an attack against so-called elite institutions somehow riles a populist base. So it's partly that. It's said to be on the basis of anti-Semitism in these institutions. That is both a laughable and a tragic claim. These are not anti-Semitic institutions at all. The whole idea is completely absurd. Partly it's at the claim that those who protest against Israel's violence and war crimes in Gaza are somehow against American foreign policy. This too is absolutely absurd and tragic. First, we have the right of free speech in the United States under the US Constitution. And second, substantively, protesting against Israel's war crimes is meritorious. It's not some kind of deficiency or something that needs an excuse. It's meritorious because Israel is engaged in absolutely horrendous war crimes. And so when you add it all up, the attack on the universities is dreadful. It is self-destructive of the United States because a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our science and technology come out of these institutions. We are in what I compare to China's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was a disastrous period for China, where the universities were closed down, the economy was in turmoil. And this is what the US is, the Trump administration seems to be promoting right now, that kind of cultural revolution. You asked me about Harvard's stand, saying, no, we won't do that. Of course, this is the correct position. It's other universities have basically given in for the moment to the administration's threats. But Harvard says, no, we're not going to destroy our institution, which, by the way, in the case of Harvard, was founded in 1636. So we're nearing the 400th anniversary of the institution. It's a lot longer lived than the Trump administration and even the United States government.
Right. You mentioned foreign policy. I had spoken to Ambassador John Bolton recently, a man who once was the national security advisor to President Trump and now practically disagrees with almost every single policy of his. He had said something interesting about Trump, that the president views ties with other countries through the lens of personal relations. So if he thinks that he is good friends with Russian President Vladimir Putin, then in his mind, US has good relations with Russia. What do you make of that?
I'm not a huge fan of Ambassador Bolton. First of all, so in his own memoirs, he talks about how he tricked Trump in one way or another, that he tried to manipulate Trump. So I also don't approve of that kind of behavior. What I would say is that the Trump foreign policy is all over the map. On the one side, he's trying to end the war in Ukraine, and I support Trump for that. He's also entered into negotiations with Iran, and I also view that as highly desirable and meritorious, because remember that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu wants the United States to go to war with Iran, which would be absolutely mindless and destructive. At the same time, Trump has basically given a green light to Israel's violence and ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and I find that abhorrent. Also, Trump has abandoned many of the global UN processes, which I believe are central for human well-being. The fight against climate change. Trump is not only denouncing and absenting the United States, but now attacking institutions that are trying to head off the worst of climate change. And India, of course, is going to be one of the great victims of the global climate change, given India's climate itself, India's own vulnerabilities. So Trump is no friend to the world on such actions, but there are areas where Trump is doing the right thing and many where he's doing very harmful things.
Recently, former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba gave an opinion. In his own words, he said that it was an unpopular one. He said something on the lines of Trump believes he needs Russia and he doesn't need Ukraine. He thinks that Trump is doing it because Trump is not doing it rather because he's an agent of Russia or anything. He sincerely believes in a worldview that is different from Ukraine. And I want to ask you, do you really think that this opinion could be true, that Trump actually believes that it needs Russia and not Ukraine?
Well, Trump said something that is right, which is that this is Biden's war, not his war. He doesn't want it. What's also true is that what Mr. Kuleba and President Zelensky supported was extremely costly for Ukraine. I don't think that this war has done any good for Ukraine. It's been utterly destructive. The big mistake that Ukraine made was abandoning neutrality and aiming to become part of NATO. And to do that on Russia's border was reckless behavior, absolutely dangerous and provocative. And I told the Ukrainians that don't go that route. You will create grave risks for yourself. There's a famous adage of Henry Kissinger, which many people now know. Henry Kissinger said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, to be a friend is fatal. And what he meant by that is when the US tells you something like, oh, why don't you join NATO? This can be fatal to you. The Ukrainians were very naive. Mr. Kuleba is very naive. Mr. Zelensky is very naive. They thought, oh, the US has our back. I tried to tell them for years, if you go down that road, Ukraine will be destroyed. If you stay with neutrality, Ukraine will be safe. Well, they went the way of trying to become part of the US security system. And Russia said, no, we're not having that on our border. And this is the result. So in this sense, I think that Trump's actions are in line with Ukraine's interests and with US interests and with Russia's interests. In other words, ending a war is win-win. It's not a win-lose.
But the terms, don't you think that matters?
Of course, the terms matter. And the terms that Ukraine could have gotten 3 years ago on April 15th, 2022, in the Istanbul process were better terms than they can get now. And the United States talked them out of it, and Zelensky abandoned the negotiations 3 years ago. This is the result of making major, major policy mistakes for one's country. It's terrible. It's tragic. In those 3 years since the Istanbul process, Ukraine has probably lost 1 million soldiers to deaths and serious injuries. It's all tragic because this war could have ended 3 years ago. It could have been avoided altogether.
Right. Professor Sachs, in an earlier speech, you mentioned that the war in Ukraine is just a sideshow and the real conflict is coming in the future with China. Could you explain that?
Oh, I don't view it that way, but that's how Washington views it. So just to be clear, the Ukraine war is anything but a sideshow. It has had terrible damage to Ukraine. It's cost innumerable lives. By the way, it's done incredible damage to the European economy as well. It's not a sideshow, it's an utter tragedy. But there are American leaders, some of whom I regard as utterly wrong-headed in their approach, who say we should close up the Ukraine war so that we prepare for a war with China. Well, again, I believe that there is no case in the world for a U.S. war with China. It would be a grave disaster for the United States and quite possibly for the whole world. And we should do everything to have normal diplomacy. My main view is that the big powers, the United States, Russia, China, India, should take care not to go into conflict with each other. India and China are now engaged in important diplomacy because there has been conflict and there needs to be diplomacy. The United States needs diplomacy with Russia. The United States needs diplomacy with China. The great powers of the world, and I named the four of them right now, need to stay out of each other's conflict zones. They need to stay out of each other's lanes. They need to not cross each other's red lines, because this is a world of nuclear superpowers that can do not only irreparable, irreversible damage, can end humanity by missteps. And so we need to have, first and foremost, some respect among the major powers for each other, that they are not getting into open conflict.
Professor Sachs, a minute ago, you talked about the cost one has to pay to be Washington's friend. Do you think Europe has learned that in the hard way?
Europe hasn't learned much right now. Europe is very confused, I'm afraid. The problem with Europe is this is a world of big players. Well, the US has 335 million people, so by India's standards, not so big. India, more than 1.4 billion, approaching 1.5 billion. China, 1.4 billion. Russia, the largest landmass in the world of 11 time zones, rich in resources, and so forth. Europe is divided among 27 individual countries, and they do not have foreign policy heft. They don't have military heft. By themselves alone, they don't have economic heft. So they created a union to try to do better, but that union is quite weak. It does not really have authority in foreign policy or in security policy. The result is that Europe has basically depended on the United States for its security arrangements. That has been, according to the Kissinger adage, not so good for Europe, but they don't have clarity of how to act till now. And so they're very divided. They don't understand how to make diplomacy with Russia, which they absolutely need to do. Europe should be the fifth of those big powers, but it's not right now, because it doesn't have the organization, the self-confidence, or the diplomatic structures to be one of the five major powers right now. This is really a structural problem for Europe.
You're an American Jew, Professor Sachs. What do you make of US's foreign policy towards Israel, especially after the war in Gaza?
Well, I think the U.S. policy is a disgrace, because Israel's policy in the Middle East is a disgrace. Israel, in my view, has been committing genocidal crimes in Gaza. By that, I mean violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. Israel is intent on ethnically cleansing the Gaza, meaning the Gaza Strip, meaning that it wants to create conditions in Gaza that make life in Gaza unlivable, so that more than 2 million people will be forced to leave. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of Israel. The International Court of Justice has a major case before it, brought originally by South Africa and now with many other governments joining the case, claiming that Israel is in violation of the Genocide Convention. I find Israel's actions abhorrent. I can say this is a little bit of a digression. They are not Jewish values. These are state behaviors. And the way that the Israel state is behaving is reckless. And it is the reason, by the way, why war continues throughout the Middle East, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Lebanon and in Syria and in many other places. Because until there is a state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace, the so-called two-state solution, until that happens, there will be war in the Middle East. And Israel has rejected the two-state solution. My own view is that since Israel has no veto on whether or not there is a state of Palestine in the UN, the one that has a veto is the United States. The whole world should tell the United States, end your veto on a state of Palestine so that there can be the state of Palestine as the 194th UN member state. And by bringing a state of Palestine into existence alongside Israel, that two-state solution will allow for an end of the wars and a normalization of relations throughout the region. The United States is the biggest single blockage to peace in the Middle East. Of course, it's Israel's policies that are the most damaging, but the United States has backed Israel's policies to the hilt up until now. And this is tragic, not only for the Palestinian people, but for the people throughout the Middle East and for the whole world, which suffers the dangers and consequences of ongoing Middle East war. So this is my particular view.
Trump is going to be in the White House for the next 4 years. So when it comes to Gaza, do you see any major change coming their way?
First, with Trump, the way that we have this one-person rule, you never know. The policies the United States is pursuing vis-a-vis Israel up until now to back Israel no matter what are very destructive of U.S. interests. They isolate the United States from the rest of the world, which supports an end to war in the Middle East. So if Trump views policy in the Middle East not through what Israel tells the United States to do, but what the United States should do on its own behalf, Trump would change course. The fact that the Trump administration has opened negotiations with Iran rather than bombing Iran, as Netanyahu wants, shows that there could be a U.S. foreign policy, not just an Israel foreign policy. So I don't discard the possibility that Trump changes the approach and tells Israel, for the sake of peace, for the sake of the world, actually for the sake of Israel's own long-term survival, the United States is going to support the two-state solution and vote to admit Palestine as the 194th UN member state. I don't discard that as a possibility by any means.
We were all relieved when we heard that United States and Iran have started indirect nuclear talks, but at least it's a start. There have been 2 rounds already. But at the same time, there is this hawkish narrative coming out of Washington, specifically by President Trump, where he almost keeps a war on standby and threatening Iran that if the talks fail, there'll be dire consequences. Is this Trump in his own element, or is a war on the horizon?
Netanyahu wants to have a war with Iran. More specifically, Netanyahu wants the United States to have a war with Iran. This could be devastating. Everybody should understand Iran is a powerful country. It's got formidable armaments, and it has a security agreement with Russia. To go to war with Iran is to play with fire. It's to play with the risk of global war. Now, The United States is in no position to have any wars right now, by the way. Our whole political scene in the United States is completely polarized. Our finances are completely unstable. Our geopolitics is completely uncertain. To have another war right now would be a profound disaster and blunder for the United States, not a 1 day or 2 day operation, but a disaster. So
But
in
Professor
this,
Sachs, sorry,
yes,
sorry, sorry to cut you off, but United States has never had a direct war. I mean, it's known for its proxy wars. So United States doesn't exactly have to go to war, right?
well, the United States has many direct wars. Sometimes they're overt, like the wars in Iraq. Sometimes they
Hmm.
are covert, like the war in Syria.
Yeah.
But the United States has had troops all over the place. It hasn't won very many wars, by the way. This is another matter. All that military might. The fact of the matter is, wars are about politics, and the United States is typically stupid about politics, knows nothing about politics. It thinks that its fighter jets and its bombs and its cruise missiles carry the day, but the Taliban ended up winning in Afghanistan. Isn't it the case? The Vietnamese ended up winning in that war, and the list is quite long. So I think the United States foreign policy has been arrogant and naive for many, many decades. This doesn't just have to do with Trump or Biden. I've not found American foreign policy in my professional lifetime to make much sense at all. Um,
Hmm.
Here's a country, I live in a country that has everything, and it just can't seem to do anything for the benefit of its people or other countries. So this is this is the big paradox. American foreign policy in the interests of the American people would not be about war. It would be about peace, about diplomacy, about mutual well-being. But we haven't had that kind of foreign policy for a very long time. But you asked me, what about these hawkish voices? What about Trump's hawkish statements? This is partly his bluster. Trump thinks that if you want to negotiate with someone, you have to beat them up first. You have to threaten them. You have to tell them, you know, I'm your best friend, and I'm going to absolutely destroy you unless you do what I want. This is standard practice for Trump. But there are powerful voices in Washington that simply are part of the Israel lobby. They receive a lot of campaign contributions, or we have a strange phenomenon, a little hard to understand, but there's a strong Christian fundamentalist support for Israel. The Zionism is not only Jewish support, it's Christian fundamentalist support, and that's tens of millions of Americans. And so there's a lot of strange dynamics in the United States that push for war in the Middle East on Israel's behalf. And the United States has gone to war many times in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, in actually the Horn of Africa, in Libya, at Israel's behest. It's unbelievable, to have your military supporting some ally who tells you to go to war on their behalf. But that's what the United States has done repeatedly because of the power of this lobby. And so we don't know ever will the U.S. again succumb to these outlandish demands by the government of Israel.
All right, Professor Sachs, I want to talk about a country one doesn't really think of when it comes to US foreign policy. You've said in the past that North Korea could have been dealt with differently. Please tell us the alternative, and how would that have positioned Pyongyang in the world we are living in?
Of course, one has to go back to the details, and there are debates about them. But at the end of the 1990s, the Clinton administration and North Korea had an agreement for North Korea to end its nuclear arms program in return for several measures of support by the United States, including normalization of diplomatic and economic relations, an end of sanctions, and building actually a nuclear facility for peaceful nuclear power. The United States reneged, dragged its feet, never got around to doing the parts that it was doing. The United States claimed that North Korea continued to pursue its armaments despite the agreement. So, as is often the case with two sides that absolutely do not trust each other, an agreement was reached, and then each side claimed the other was violating the agreement. I know that part of the North Korean claims were correct. The U.S., the Clinton administration faced resistance to carrying out things that the U.S. promised to do. Now, when the George W. Bush Jr. administration came into office on January 20th, 2001, with Ambassador Bolton as being the national security advisor, Bolton said we should scrap all of these agreements with North Korea and just put on maximal pressure. And indeed, the diplomacy was completely ended and the maximal pressure regime was put on. And you look back 25 years onward, well, was that approach successful? I think the answer was decidedly no. North Korea was not deterred from building what is now a formidable arsenal of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. So the maximal pressure approach was greatly exaggerated once again. To solve problems in this world requires diplomacy. Making threats or going to war to solve problems fail to solve those problems. The key in every conflict is to understand the underlying politics and how to address the conflict on a political level, because addressing an underlying political conflict on a military level does not work.
Professor Sachs, my next question is not just from the lens of President Donald Trump's administration, but just United States overall. Do you think the world is now realizing that Washington isn't a reliable partner?
Boy, I think the world should realize that the United States is just one of many countries. It is not the be all and end all and the key to success or the key to prosperity or the key to security that many countries have imagined or hoped it would be. The United States is 4.1% of the world population. It's about 12 or 13% of international trade. It's roughly 14 to 15% of world output. That's an important country, but it's not the indispensable country. It's not the world hegemon. It's not the country that you must befriend in order to prosper. And it's not the country that is going to save you from yourself or save you in your neighborhood or guarantee your security. So other countries should treat the United States on sensible grounds, that it would be good to have good relations with the United States. I hope that that would be the case, that it would be reciprocated, but not that the United States is going to somehow save you from many other issues. For example, China and India have an extraordinarily important bilateral relationship as well as a contested border. The United States is not going to solve that problem for India, or India, quote, siding with the United States against China. It would be fatuous. It would make no sense at all. It's so unimaginable, but I'm just hoping that no one would have an illusion about that. I'm not a fan at all of the so-called Quad arrangement, which is India, Japan, Australia, United States. What is that? To team up against China? Come on, that's the kind of thing where I think it's a very naive U.S. approach, and not a good idea for any other country to say, oh, that's good for us. That's not good for any country, especially a great power like India, to team up with the United States thinking that's going to somehow solve a problem. I don't think India has that view of teaming up in that way, but I would just say that's the general point that governments around the world sometimes have said in the last 50 years, oh, we better be really close to the United States. That's vital for our security. No, remember Kissinger's adage, keep your distance, be respectful, have good relations. I'm not saying to have bad relations, but I'm saying don't depend on the US as some magical force in this world that provides answers. The US is what it is. It's 4.1% of the world population. It votes against the world majority more than just about, perhaps more than any other country in the UN. And it's in some kind of conflict all over the place. So I would advise governments don't get into those conflicts. Rather, tell the United States, calm down, chill, don't go to another war, too many wars. Also, I should just mention the United States has around 750 overseas military bases in around 80 countries. If I were one of those countries, I would thank the United States for its service and suggest, why don't we close the base? You go home, and it'll be better for all of us. You'll save money. It will save the problems. Your base is not our security. It just seems to me that these overseas military bases are provocations. They're not solutions.
Since we're talking about calming down the United States, do you think Washington is finding it hard to believe that the world doesn't revolve around it anymore?
The mindset is very hard to break. I get a magazine every couple of months called Foreign Affairs Magazine, which is a publication of our leading non-governmental foreign policy think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. Almost every story and almost every issue is trying to reassure the Americans that they're still number one. That's not exactly the text, but that is, when you read the magazine, it's you see the psychology involved. The U.S. is a little bit shocked. The U.S. political system is shocked. Where did China come from? Boy, they're going to be shocked with India too. Believe me, it's the same story. They cannot believe that they're not alone at the perch on top. So psychologically, this was a big blow. Biden never recognized the change of the world. Biden, till his last moments, talked about the U.S. as the indispensable country, the U.S. as the world leader, and so on. I found his rhetoric about 30 years out of date. And Trump still believes that the U.S. is so rich, so powerful, that the threat to close the U.S. market is going to make the whole world stand in line begging. Trump even used the vulgarity that countries are lining up to kiss my ass. That's the president's terms. So that's the only reason I would say this. But in any event, that's an American view. It's a little strange. If you travel the world, if you see the world, if you spend any time in Asia, the world does not revolve around the United States, thank you. But in Washington, they still believe so.
I think President Trump is the only US president where we can't sometimes quote him on air as reporters because it's just not part of our style sheet. We can't do it.
Yes, I'm sorry to do it, but it's a direct quote of the president.
Yeah, no, no, I completely understand. You can do it. I can't. It's just like that. Uh, then, Professor Sachs, I'm wondering, why do you think Americans voted for Trump?
They voted against Biden and Harris, basically. Our
Mm.
elections, to the maximum extent, are referendums on the incumbent. Are things going well or not going well? If they're not going well, you vote against the incumbent. And so that's what this was.
Do you think Trump will go to the extent of changing the Constitution and then running for a third term?
Well, he's an old man, and he, can have his own ideas, and he's got a lot of yes people around him telling him that
Mm.
whatever he says is fine. And every day he issues a decree that starts out by the powers vested in me as president of the United States. I decree the following, and he doesn't have those powers. So I wouldn't put anything past him as to what he'll try. Who knows?
All right, Professor Sachs, that's the end of my questions. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and giving us your insights on
Of
literally
course.
everything under the sun.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.